The gymnasium smelled of recycled air and the faint musk of a dozen species exertion. Overhead lights cast harsh white pools onto the padded deck where the combat pairing had been called. Kayla Wren tightened the straps on her uniform tunic and faced her opponent, a crag cadet named Gravak, whose shoulders were as wide as she was tall. His bronze skin gleamed under the lights, and his four-fingered hands flexed with easy anticipation. Around the circle, other cadets murmured. A Sawyer with velvet-textured scalp ridges clicked his tongue. A pair of slender, feathered Wren leaned together, their gaze bright with amusement. "Begin," the instructor, a battle-scarred crag named Drosk, grunted. Gravak lunged. Kayla sidestepped poorly too slowly by intent, and his forearm caught her across the ribs. She let the impact carry her into a roll, coming up shaky, breathing hard. The watching cadets laughed, short and scornful. The human was soft, exactly as the orientation packet said. Frail bones, low muscle density, a backward planet with negligible threat profile. Gravak circled, tail sweeping the mat. He swept her legs and she dropped back, slapping the deck. She made herself gasp, eyes wide. The laughter grew louder. From the observation balcony, Commander Elias Thorne watched, arms crossed. His face betrayed nothing, but his jaw tightened minutely. He saw what the aliens could not, the way Kayla absorbed each blow not as a victim, but as a sponge, reading kinetic intent, mapping the crag's balance. He knew the woman under the mask of mediocrity. Kayla Wren was a weaver, trained from childhood in a doctrine so secret Earth's own diplomatic corps barely acknowledged it. Her assignment was to observe, to blend, to be forgettable. The coalition could not yet know what humans truly were. Drosk ended the bout. "Cadet Wren, you continue to disappoint. Report to medical." The instructor's voice carried the tired contempt of someone who believed he was wasting oxygen. Kayla bowed, wobbling for effect, and limped toward the exit. In the corridor, Thorne fell into step beside her. They walked in silence until they reached a maintenance junction. "Gravak cracked a rib this time," Thorne murmured. "Just bruised, I rolled with it." Her voice was soft but entirely steady. The trembling had stopped the instant she left the gym. "Heard the Nyrath have been probing the outer beacons. Could be nothing. Or it could be something." Her dark eyes met his. "If the station goes hot, the rules change." Thorne nodded. "Until then, you're the frail little human, clear." Crystal, the word almost made her smile. Nothing about her life was clear. The attack came 6 hours later, during the third watch cycle. The first warning was a station-wide tremor that sent unsecured data slates skidding off desks. Kayla was in her dormitory pod, reading a tactical manual masked as romance fiction. The lights flickered, then shifted to emergency amber. A klaxon blatted twice before the voice of the station AI cut in, calm and dreadful. "Unscheduled breach, sectors 7 through 12. Hostile borders confirmed. All cadets to emergency shelters." She was already moving, pulling on boots, securing a small flat tool from her kit, nothing that looked like a weapon but could become many things in trained hands. In the corridor, chaos reigned. Cadets ran, some armored, some half-dressed. A young Vespid with delicate sensory fronds, Tilly, she remembered from xenobiology class, was struggling to keep up, her multi-jointed legs skittering on the smooth plating. A shuddering explosion ahead tore a bulkhead open. Armored shapes boiled through the smoke. Nyrath, tall and sinewy, their scaled hides painted with jagged clan marks. They carried serrated boarding axes and zero-recoil slug throwers. The first cadet who stood in their path, a Wren with no combat armor, was cut down in a spray of feathers and misted blood. Kayla grabbed Tilly and shoved her into a maintenance alcove. "Stay down, don't make a sound." Then the ceiling collapsed between them, a rain of alloy and sparking conduits sealing the alcove off from the main corridor. Kayla found herself on the wrong side of the debris, alone, as 3 Nyrath turned toward the small human female who was supposed to be terrified. She let her shoulders slump, she whimpered, she backed away, hands up. The lead Nyrath hissed something that translated roughly as "easy meat." He took a lazy step forward, axe low. What happened next was too fast for the Nyrath's visual cortex to parse, but the damaged security drone lodged in the ceiling above recorded it all. A shift of weight, a pivot, a small hand striking the inside of a wrist, the axe spinning free, then a knee driving into a scaled throat with enough force to crush cartilage. The second Nyrath died before his companion hit the deck, his own weapon buried in his chest after a two-motion disarm. The third managed to squeeze off a shot that went wide before his neck, met the edge of a torn wall plate. 3 bodies down in under 6 seconds. Kayla didn't pause. She stripped a slug thrower and ammunition belt from a corpse, checked the drone's indicator light, still blinking, and vanished into the smoke, moving toward the sound of screams she might be able to stop. Part 2. The station's internal sensors had failed in the initial bombardment, but the security net had enough redundancy to spool fragmented feeds to the command bunker. In the chaos of the repulsed boarding action, no one immediately looked. By the time the Nyrath raiders pulled back, leaving 83 cadets and crew dead, the station's AI had auto-flagged a data spike from Corridor Gamma 12, a drone with a cracked lens that had stored 41 seconds of continuous movement. The footage sat in a buffer for 7 hours. Then a junior intelligence analyst, a Soldier named Quent, began the grim task of sequencing the attack timeline for the after-action report. When he reached the Gamma 12 file, his upper tendrils went rigid. He watched the small human stumble, beg, and then become something that made his digestive tract clench. Quent summoned his superior. That officer summoned the station commander. Within 20 minutes, the core recording was locked under the highest classification, and Admiral Zorath's personal eyes-only seal. The war recording, as it would become known, showed no hesitation, no wasted motion, no mercy. It showed a predator so perfectly disguised that the entire interspecies military integration program had been unknowingly hosting a singularity of lethal intent. And that singularity, right now, was sitting in the trauma recovery ward, wearing a standard medical gown and a rehearsed expression of hollow shock. Kayla kept her hands folded in her lap while a Crag medic scanned her for injuries she didn't have. Across the bay, Tilly was being treated for superficial cuts, her large amber eyes occasionally darting toward the human who had pushed her into an alcove before the ceiling fell. The little Vespid didn't understand why she was alive. She remembered pressure on her carapace, a human voice saying, "Stay down," and then nothing but darkness and shaking. Other survivors milled about. Gravek, the Crag who had tossed Kayla around in the gym, sat with his head in his hands, his arm in a sling. He had fought and he had lost 3 friends. He glanced at Kayla, saw her wrapped in a thermal blanket, trembling slightly, and felt a distant, useless guilt. Then the security detail arrived. 6 armed Crag in full armor spread through the recovery bay. Their squad leader, a veteran with deeply scarred brow ridges, scanned the room and locked onto Kayla. "Cadet Wren, you are ordered to accompany us to Strategic Briefing Room 1. Admiral Zorath requires your presence." Kayla looked up, eyes wide, lip quivering with what she made sure looked like fear. "Is something wrong?" "That will be explained upon arrival." She stood, letting the blanket slip, and padded after them on bare feet. Behind her, Tilly chirped a small, worried sound. The strategic briefing room was not designed for comfort. A single oval table dominated the space, ringed by high-backed chairs currently occupied by the senior command staff of Coalition Garrison Nexus Point. Admiral Zorath sat at the head, his heavy brow casting his eyes into shadow. Beside him, General Sillies of the Vespid hovered on a suspensor disc, her segmented shell glinting dully. Human Ambassador Leora Voss stood near the far wall, arms loose at her sides, her face unreadable. Commander Thorne was beside her, his expression carved from granite. A holographic projection flickered to life above the table. The recording, cleaned up and time-stamped, began to play. Kayla watched herself kill 3 Nyrath. She didn't flinch. She didn't bother maintaining the act anymore. The evidence was absolute. Instead, she stood with her weight balanced, her breathing slow, and waited. Admiral Zorath let the recording loop twice before speaking. 3 boarders in under 6 seconds. 3 confirmed kills with environmental objects and bare hands. This is not the performance of a cadet who cannot hold her footing against a training partner. Explain. Thorne stepped forward before Kayla could speak. She was acting under my orders, Admiral. Her presence here was a sanctioned intelligence operation, authorized by the Terran Diplomatic Directive. Her mission was to assess integration protocols and identify vulnerabilities, without revealing Earth's actual combat proficiency. General Sillies' vocal membrane vibrated with anger. You inserted a living weapon into a school filled with our young and told us she was harmless. That is not intelligence gathering. That is a violation of every trust agreement we signed. Ambassador Voss lifted a hand. General, the trust agreements were signed in mutual ignorance. Your intelligence dossiers on humanity were curated. We allowed you to believe we were a low-tier species because we needed to know if the coalition could accept us as allies without fear overshadowing every negotiation. So far, that fear has proved legitimate. She gestured at the projection. But look beyond the kills. The feed advanced. A second angle, pulled from a nearby comms relay, showed Kayla dragging a wounded Solier cadet into a maintenance shaft while firing a captured slug thrower with her other hand, covering their retreat. Another clip showed her crushing the weapon arm of a Nyrath who had been about to execute a group of unarmed cadets, then leaving him alive but disabled, moving on without pause. She saved 37 individuals during the breach, Voss said, including your own niece, Admiral. Zorath's heavy jaw worked. His niece, a young crag, was among the engineering cadets who had been trapped near Sector 9. He had already read the reports that described a small figure dragging debris off her pinned body before guiding the group to safety. This changes nothing about the deception, Sillies pressed. Your species is dangerous. The question is what we do with that danger now. Zorath slammed his palm on the table, the sound echoing like a gong. Here is what we do. Tomorrow in the primary arena, with every cadet and officer present and the entire Corps feed broadcasting live, Cadet Wren will face our Academy champion, Brackus, in an unarmed contest. No armor, no weapons, no interference. If your restraint is as real as you claim, prove it. Let the galaxy see whether the monster in the recording can also be what you say, a guardian. Kayla spoke for the first time, her voice quiet but carrying absolute weight. I agree. On one condition, no recording is edited. The full exchange runs beginning to end. Zorath stared at her for a long moment, accepted. As she was escorted out, Thorne caught her eye. The tiny twitch at the corner of his mouth was the only permission she needed. Part 3. The night before the duel, Kayla sat in a sterile prep chamber, cross-legged on the floor, eyes closed. Her muscles were warm from a light flow of movement, but her mind was the true battlefield. She walked the memory palaces she'd been taught in her 6th year, reciting the litanies of control. The strike that is never thrown breaks the greatest force. The blade in the sheath shapes the treaty. A chime at the door. She opened her eyes to find Tilly standing there, a guard looming behind her. The little Vespid's sensory fronds drooped with exhaustion, but she held out a small, crudely woven bracelet made of colored wire and a single polished gear. I wanted to say something, Tilly clicked softly. You pushed me before the ceiling fell. That wasn't in the recording. No one saw that part, but I remember. Kayla took the bracelet, turning it over in her fingers. You needed to live. You still do. Is it true what they're saying? Tilly's large eyes searched her face. That you're a weapon. Kayla slipped the bracelet onto her wrist. I'm someone who was given a very sharp edge and told to keep it hidden. Tonight, I stop hiding, but I'll still protect you. That doesn't change. The Vespid hesitated, then tapped her forehead gently against Kayla's knuckles, a gesture of trust among her species. Without another word, she scurried out. The arena was a massive inverted bowl carved into the station's upper docking ring. By the time Kayla walked the entry tunnel, the terrace seating was packed. Every cadet, officer, and civilian who could squeeze in was present, and holoprojectors transmitted the feed to millions of screens across Coalition space. News of the war recording had spread, twisted by rumor into something between horror and dark legend. The official explanation, a prearranged demonstration of human restraint, barely dented the frenzy. Gravek sat in the third row, his injured arm aching. He saw Kayla enter barefoot, wearing simple gray fatigues. She looked so small against the vastness of the arena. The same small woman he had laughed at, the same soft thing he had knocked down without effort. His throat tightened with a mix of shame and something stranger, awe. On the opposite side, Brackus emerged. The crag champion was 2.5 meters of conditioned muscle and dense bone, his bare chest crisscrossed with victory scars. He carried no weapons, but his hands alone were crushing implements. The crowd roared for him. Admiral Nyrath's voice boomed from the address system. This is an unarmed contest. Sublethal submission is the only acceptable conclusion. If either combatant renders the other permanently damaged, they will forfeit and face tribunal. Begin. Brackus charged instantly, a freight train of bone and fury. Kayla didn't retreat. She stepped into the arc of his swing, rotating her body past his knuckles by a finger's width and drove 2 knuckles into the nerve cluster beneath his primary arm's elbow. The limb went limp. Brackus bellowed, spinning, lashing with his tail. Kayla dropped under it, hooked his ankle with her foot, and torqued his knee sideways just enough to buckle his stance. He crashed to one knee. She flowed around him, tapping points along his spine, his secondary shoulder, the base of his skull, each touch precise, non-lethal, shutting down motor function in cascading waves. The entire sequence took 48 seconds. Brackus lay face down, conscious but incapable of voluntary movement below his neck. The arena was silent. Not a single voice, not a chirp, not a breath. Kayla straightened, breathing evenly, and walked around to Brackus's head. She knelt and placed a hand on his shoulder. The gesture was gentle. She whispered something only he could hear, then helped roll him onto his back and began the nerve reset sequence that would restore his mobility in minutes. She rose and faced the observation balcony. "I could have killed him in 3 seconds," she said, her voice picked up by every microphone in the station. "I chose not to. That is the point. My species knows how to destroy. We learned it in the cradle of a world that tried to kill us every single day of our evolution. But we also learned to love fiercely enough that destruction became a last resort, not a first instinct. That is what I hid in class. Not weakness, but the will to not use what I carry." The silence stretched. Then Brackus, still prone, let out a deep, rumbling laugh. "I yield," he grunted, "and I am extremely glad she is on our side." A few nervous chirps rose from the audience, then scattered applause, then a groundswell of something that might have been relief. Somewhere in the civilian networking nodes, an unknown actor with access to the original drone footage chose that moment to dump the raw, unedited file onto every public news channel. No voiceover, no context. Just a small human woman killing with machine precision and then saving children. The galaxy woke to the impossible truth. Part 4. The crisis broke across the core worlds like a shockwave. On the Vespian homeworld, councils were suspended. On the crag colonial strongholds, veteran warriors debated in harsh whispers whether humanity represented an existential threat. The phrase "hidden predator" dominated headlines, while fringe outlets ran the footage alongside dramatized reenactments of ancient human atrocities from their own history books. Wars, purges, genocides Earth had long ago confronted and moved beyond. Ambassador Leora Voss requested emergency floor time in the Coalition Assembly, and got it within the hour. The Grand Chamber was a hemisphere of floating galleries, each packed with representatives from 62 sentient species. Voss stood at the central dais, unarmed, in a simple diplomatic coat. Behind her, a massive display showed a still frame of Kayla's bloody hands gently lifting a concussed Solier cadet away from a burning corridor. "I am not here to apologize for humanity's strength," Voss began, her voice carrying clear through the translation arrays. "I am here to explain why we hid it and why you should thank us for that choice." Murmurs rippled. A Rin representative ruffled her feathers in distress. Humanity evolved on a world where the food chain fought back. We come from a planet of tectonic violence, predatory flora and fauna, and competition so relentless that our ancestors had to become the single most adaptable killing organism our biosphere ever produced. We did not merely survive, we overwhelmed. And then, after centuries of turning that ferocity on each other, we stopped. We built institutions of peace. We ventured into the stars. When we met you, we faced a choice. Announce ourselves as the most dangerous thing you'd ever encountered and risk a preemptive coalition against us, or demonstrate our capacity for restraint while we learned if you could be trusted. We chose restraint. She gestured at the image behind her. The war recording that has terrified so many of you shows a human killing, but watch the full file. It also shows a human dragging wounded to safety, protecting cadets of every species, and in the final minutes before rescue, carrying a child out of a burning section while singing a lullaby to keep her calm. That is humanity. Both halves. We are not asking you to ignore the blade. We are asking you to recognize the hand that chooses when to swing it. From a side entry, Kayla walked onto the dais. She was still in the gray fatigues, the wired bracelet on her wrist catching the light. Whispers intensified. She stopped beside Voss and looked up at the assembled thousands. "I'm not a diplomat," Kayla said. "I'm a soldier who was made to be a secret. Every day I walked into that gym and let them knock me down, something inside me screamed. Not because it hurt, but because I knew that if I ever stopped pretending, I'd be seen as a monster before I could be seen as a person. I'm tired of being a monster. I want to be a shield." A crag elder in the front gallery, the matriarch of a powerful clan, rumbled a question. "And if we refuse? If we judge your species too dangerous for partnership?" Kayla met her eyes. "Then we'll go home and we'll be alone and you'll be alone and the Nyrath, who don't care about restraint, will keep coming. I think you know which outcome is worse." The elder held her gaze for a long moment, then inclined her head fractionally. It was not acceptance, but it was not rejection. The vote was postponed. Diplomats huddled in side chambers, arguing late into the station's artificial night. Voss worked the back channels, while Kayla was placed in protective isolation, less for her safety, she knew, than to keep her visible presence from inflaming the debate. Then, on the third day of deliberation, the alarm screamed again. The Nyrath had regrouped and launched a direct assault on the assembly station itself, a decapitation strike aimed at the very heart of coalition governance. Breach pods punched through the hull, and elite boarding teams flooded the diplomatic sector. In the council chamber, panicked representatives scrambled for emergency exits. Admiral Zorath bellowed orders, but the security detail was already buckling. The Nyrath had learned from the Academy attack. They were faster, better armed, and terrifyingly coordinated. Voss found Kayla in her quarters. The ambassador's face was pale but set. "This is it. If we lose the council, the coalition fractures. We need every asset." Kayla was already on her feet, stripping off the formal tunic she'd been issued for the assembly. Underneath, she wore a simple dark combat undersuit, something Thorne had slipped to her hours earlier. "I'll need a tack channel, and anyone who can hold a position." "You'll have it. The live feeds are staying on. The galaxy's watching, Kayla. Give them the truth." "No more hiding," Kayla said, and stepped into the corridor as the first explosion shook the bulkheads. Part 5. The assembly station became a maze of smoke and gunfire. Nyrath shock troops pushed toward the central chamber with overwhelming force, their slug throwers chewing through makeshift barricades. Coalition security was brave but unprepared for the ferocity of the assault. Delegates screamed, huddled, or tried to fight with ceremonial sidearms that barely scratched Nyrath armor. Into this chaos, Kayla moved like a thought made physical. She took no weapon of her own at first. The first Nyrath she encountered died with his own blade twisted into his throat. His slug thrower claimed and emptied into two more before the body hit the deck. She directed a squad of terrified crag guards to a crossfire position with a few clipped words and a hand signal Thorne had taught the unit the previous year. The crag obeyed without question, their fear of her eclipsed by a sudden, desperate hope. The live feeds, never deactivated from the earlier session, now broadcast the battle to every corner of Coalition space. The galaxy watched as the hidden monster became the architect of survival. A Nyrath heavy breached a side gallery, targeting a cluster of unarmed Vespid delegates. Kayla slid across the polished floor on her hip, put 2 rounds into the heavy's knee joint, and then used his collapsing body as a springboard to reach the gallery level. She dispatched the backup team with a broken length of railing, its edge sharpened by a plasma burn. The Vespid delegates, their sensory fronds flat with terror, stared as she paused, breathing hard, and said, "There's a safer junction 1 deck down. Move now." They moved. On another front, a young crag elder, the same matriarch who had questioned her in the chamber, took a bolt to the chest plate. She went down, gasping, as her guards fell around her. Kayla was there before the Nyrath could finish the kill. She killed the first with the butt of an empty rifle, the second with a thumb driven into the gap between helmet and gorget. Then she dropped to her knees, ignoring the incoming fire, and tore away the shattered armor to assess the wound. "Pressure here," she ordered a surviving guard, pressing his hand to the matriarch's wound. "Keep it tight. You carry her." She pointed to another. "I'll clear the path." She cleared it with such brutal efficiency that the Nyrath advance stalled. Their commander, a massive scaled figure with ritual scars along his snout, realized the human was tearing his assault apart. He redirected all available units toward her position, a tactical error that allowed the Coalition forces to regroup. The final confrontation came in a wide loading bay that had become an impromptu triage center. The Nyrath commander himself led the charge, a powered blade humming in his grip. Kayla met him in the center of the bay. She had no weapon left except a length of snapped conduit in her own body. Their fight was not the clean choreography of the arena. It was ugly, fast, and desperate. The Nyrath was stronger, his armor absorbing blows that would have shattered bone. Kayla was faster, reading his twitches, bleeding from a dozen shallow cuts but never slowing. She shattered his blade hand with a torsion lock, then drove the conduit through his shoulder joint, pinning him to a bulkhead. He snarled, expecting death. She stepped back. "I'm not going to kill you. You're going to tell us where your staging base is, and then you're going to help us make sure your people never try this again." She pulled him off the bulkhead, dragged him to the nearest security team, and collapsed to one knee, suddenly trembling with exhaustion. The cameras caught it all. The blood, the tears she finally allowed to fall, the way her voice cracked when she called for a medic for the wounded matriarch. Then, because the universe had a sense of cruel poetry, a small Vespid shape emerged from the triage area. Tilly, her fronds singed, her multi-jointed legs splinted, limped across the bay. She had been visiting a delegate relative when the attack came. She stopped in front of Kayla, who was still on her knees, and wrapped her 4 small arms around the human's neck. Kayla held her. Then, almost without thinking, she began to sing an old earth lullaby, soft and tuneless, a thing her own mother had hummed when nightmares came. The sound carried through the open microphones. Across the galaxy, billions watched the blood-soaked warrior rock a child and murmur a simple, gentle melody. No commentary could improve the image. The truth Voss had spoken was no longer an argument. It was visible. Part 6. The Nyrath commander, broken and furious, gave up the staging base coordinates within the hour. A combined fleet, already en route after the initial assault, diverted and caught the enemy carrier group off guard. The engagement was brief and decisive. The immediate threat was over. In the aftermath, the assembly reconvened. The atmosphere had shifted. The galleries were full, but the fear had been tempered by something new. The footage of Kayla shielding the crag elder, the Vespid delegates, and singing to Tilly had been looped so many times on public channels that it had begun to overwrite the earlier, terrifying drone recording. Not replace it. Humanity's lethal capacity was undeniable, but frame it in a context the galaxy could comprehend. Ambassador Voss took the dais one more time. "You've seen the worst we can be and the best. We hid neither today. We simply are. The question before this assembly is not whether humanity is safe, No one here is safe. That is the nature of existence. The question is whether you want the species who will sing to your children in the rubble standing beside you, or standing alone against the dark. The vote to elevate Earth's status to full coalition member, with integrated military representation, passed by a margin that surprised even Voss. Kayla was given a small room in the diplomatic wing to recover. Her body ached in ways that would take weeks to heal, but the deeper exhaustion was in her soul. She sat on the edge of the cot, the bracelet Tilly had given her still around her wrist, now stained with blood that wasn't hers. Thorne found her there. He didn't speak for a while, just leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. Finally, he said, "You sang a lullaby on a live broadcast to 50 billion people." It was the first one I remembered. My mother used to sing it when I was afraid. Your mother was a weaver too. She also sang. Kayla looked up, eyes red-rimmed. I've spent my whole life being the hidden edge. I don't know how to be this symbol. Thorne pushed off the frame and sat on the foot of the cot. You don't have to be. Just keep choosing what you chose in that loading bay. The symbol builds itself. A soft tap at the door. Admiral Nyrath entered, moving with a weariness that made him seem older. He looked at Kayla, at her battered hands and the bracelet, and then did something no human had ever recorded a Crag admiral doing. He bowed his head. I owe you a debt. You saved my niece again and my clan matriarch. I came to tell you that the challenge in the arena was a fool's demand born of fear. I saw a monster when I should have seen a soldier. For that, I am sorry. Kayla stood, wincing, and offered her hand. After a beat, Nyrath took it, his massive fingers engulfing hers. The Academy Board has made a request, he continued. They want you to teach a new curriculum, controlled response. No hiding, no pretenses. Cadets from every species, learning how to combine appropriate force with de-escalation. The first class starts next cycle, if you're willing. She let out a breath that was almost a laugh. I thought I'd be expelled. You were never really a cadet. Now you're an instructor. Nyrath's mouth quirked. Try not to break too many champions on your first day. Part 7. 6 months later, the Academy Gymnasium looked the same. Harsh white lights, padded deck, the mingled sense of many species effort. But something fundamental had changed. At the center of the floor, instructor Kayla Wren demonstrated a wrist lock on a Crag volunteer, her movements slow and clear, narrating each point of contact. Pressure here halts motor function. If you push further, you cause permanent damage. The art is knowing where to stop. She released the lock, and the Crag flexed his fingers with a respectful nod. Around her, mixed species cadets practiced in pairs. A Wren and a Vespid worked on disengagement techniques. A Solier practiced falling safely. Gravak, now a senior cadet and an unexpected advocate for the program, helped a young human transfer student adjust his stance. The gym hummed with focused energy, not mockery. After the session, Kayla walked the station's upper garden ring, a place of imported greenery and soft artificial breezes. Tilly scampered beside her, now wearing a tiny cadet's badge. She had enrolled in the junior auxiliary, determined to learn to protect others. I saw the old recording again, Tilly said, her voice lighter now, the trauma fading into memory. The one from the first attack when you were still pretending. You looked so small. Were you ever really weak? Kayla stopped beside a planter filled with flowering vines from the Solier homeworld. She thought about the question, really thought about it, the way she'd been taught to examine a wound before treating it. I was never weak in the way they thought, she said finally. But I was afraid of being seen, afraid of what I'd become if I stopped hiding. The hiding itself, that was a different kind of weakness. It kept me alone. Tilly's fronds twitched in confusion. But now you're not alone. No, now I'm not. Kayla knelt to Tilly's eye level. Strength isn't measured by how many people you can hurt. It's measured by how many you can protect and how many you're willing to let close enough to protect you back. I forgot that second part. This place, you help me remember. The Vespid chirped a satisfied note and leaned her head against Kayla's shoulder, a gesture that had become their ritual. Farther down the garden path, Commander Thorne watched from a distance. He had a new assignment now, something about interspecies operational integration, but he always made time to check on his former charge. Voss stood beside him, cradling a cup of something hot. "She's good at this," Voss said. "She's the best of us," Thorne replied. "Always was, the rest of us just had to catch up." The camera of a station news drone, one of the respectful ones that kept a distance, captured the final image that would become the header for a dozen major historical archives. A human woman in instructor's grays, a small Vespid cadet tucked under her arm, both of them looking out a wide viewport at the star-dusted black. Behind them, in the reflection, the flags of 62 species hung in equal rows, and among them, a blue and white banner that had once stood for a death world called Earth. The galaxy had learned that humanity was dangerous. Now it was learning that danger, held in the hands of someone who chose love over fear, could become the foundation of something far greater than fragile peace. It could become a promise, kept not in silence, but in full view of the stars.